Greetings and welcome. My name is Mark Williams, and my colleagues from the Open Alliance for Cloud Adoption and I will be sharing our insights about enabling innovative, safe, and agile cloud adoption. We share similar backgrounds. We've all led large-scale cloud adoption efforts and transformed traditional IT and operations teams into agile cloud workforces. Another important thing that we all share is our mission to give back and make the cloud journey easier for those that follow us. And we all have found ourselves a home in the Open Alliance for Cloud Adoption, which we call OACA for short. And just as a brief introduction to this organization, we are a Linux Foundation project, and our mission is to share cloud adoption best practices. One of the things we're best known for is a cloud maturity model, which helps plot a journey and measure your progress along the way in various disciplines and domains that are important to functioning and operating clouds. And we have several other publications that enable technology leaders like yourselves to begin their secure digital transformation. So again, my name is Mark Williams, and I'll be moderating our discussion today with my fellow presenters. With me, we have Tom Scott, Shamir Charania, and Harish Makera. And what I wanted to kind of begin talking about today is the concept or the issue of businesses' transformation and its rapid consumption of cloud services. And there are several themes that concern all of us as leaders around this trend. One of them being that organizations within your business may become siloed or doing things individually and different from each other. They may not be set up or skilled to deal with the number of different options that are available for various cloud service providers. And the effective or efficient consumption of all of these different options often becomes a big problem. So what I'd like each panelist to do here is to share their perspective about how they see these particular problems and what solutions they see as addressing those. So I'd like to start with Shamir, please.
For sure. Thank you very much, Mark. For me, companies need to get comfortable, I think, with the agile nature of the cloud. One of the easiest and best ways to do this is through strong cost controls and processes. Everything in the cloud is ultimately billed back to you, so it really provides that holistic view of how your organization is both using the cloud today and how that cloud usage has evolved over time. This role, and to be very clear here, should be technical in nature, is really responsible for holistically understanding how cloud services are being used within the org. The key would be to create effective cost management processes that are not seen as kind of adversarial within your organization. You need to land somewhere in between, I think, the built-in kind of cost tools in the cloud providers, such as AWS Cost Management or Azure Advisor, and the full-blown financial shaming through bill back or show back processes.
Yes, I agree with that. And Harish, I was just curious, you've done a lot of work around how organizational structure works. What is your view of the process around that, and how do you use some of that to help define things like OKRs and a strategic direction around cost benefit?
Actually, it's just an extension of, there are several aspects to cloud adoption. And I think one key aspect that I'd like to touch upon today is on organization structure and updates for an organization when they embrace cloud, right? And this can take many forms, right? It could be a new company that is that wants to modernize. They go all cloud native, and when I say native, they start their work in the cloud. Others are already in that journey, and they're scaling it up. And others are still thinking of it based on what they see as market trends and what is driven by business needs. Whatever that journey is, it's very important that it's an inclusive journey. And what I mean by that is everyone within the organization, from the CEO all the way down that structure, could be business or could be in the technology teams within, have to understand what it really means, because it affects every part of the organization. And that's the reason I think the organization structure, the hierarchy, all of that will undergo a change. And with change comes a sense of fear And so this is where communication and really having a objective vision mission statement really helps people understand the why and how do we approach this journey. And one, I think, a successful approach that many really companies, even like Google, introduced this concept of OKRs, when the objective is your qualitative goal and it's measured through the key results, which is a quantitative goal. So having this language being understood across the entire organization helps clarify it and also helps understand how do we engage other teams within the company. And then these structures and the teams that change with these goals will help define the work. So this iterative loop in terms of having these OKRs guide you is also going to help in this agile journey, because change is rapid and it's not just a technology transformation we're talking about. It's not just about going to cloud, we just moving technology. It's also the way we work within a company. I think that is what is so important, that we need to continuously communicate within the organization.
Yeah,
That is
Harish,
one, that's one aspect on.
yeah, no, I agree with you on that. But what I'm concerned about is when we talk about change. Yes, change is inevitable. We all have to live with change, adopt change, and embrace change. But sometimes we don't necessarily go into it seeing clearly those defined needs. We sometimes have what I call the perceived needs. This is what we think we need, but we don't always know that. So that quantitative component of collecting the data to capture what those needs are, I believe, is really critical. But yet they don't always translate into a consumption model that meets those needs. And I'm sure you've experienced as much as I have that a service all of a sudden, lots of fanfare, so to speak, over adopting a service, and yet we're still falling short of the integration challenges, and the data, isn't matching what we expected. So I think we have to really be clear on those differences between what we define as our needs and how we perceive what we need, and plan for that accordingly. And one of those areas I've noticed that also falls a little short sometimes is our refactoring needs. We always throw it in the list, the refine, the rebuild, the refactor, the replace. But what it always comes back down to is eventually there's going to be a refactor. It's either going to be retire or refactor. And not to be black and white about it, but I think what it spells out is that to fit the old model into the new, you have to rebuild it, you have to rethink it, and you have to redeploy it. And here's the next challenge: skills. We don't always plan the skills to support that change. The skills sometimes will fall short, or we have to augment it through third-party services, which typically are temporary. They'll come in, get it up and running, and say, here you go. And then a few months later, it falls short. So I think the real solution is to augment the workload, to really help the workforce adopt the new skills and abilities by offloading what they're doing today. And so instead of bringing a team to bring something new and walk away, I think the approach should really be bringing a team to augment the workload of the operational teams that are supporting that today, let them and help them, enable them to learn new skills and abilities. But another area that I want to mention real quickly is policies around that, because again, our policies don't always align with the new paradigm. So we look at policies, and you have to remember they were written down at a time when we were hosting in data centers, and it was literally written down. I mean, it was typed out on a form and said, "Here's our policy." And now we take that policy and we try to fit it into this new consumption model, and it fails, or it's not adhered to, or someone has to go and get it. And let's face it, teams are so busy today, they're not going to really have the time or the wherewithal to go seek out a PDF, read it, interpret it, and then implement it in a way that's really, truly effective. So we need to rethink how we do policies. We need end-to-end security. We need to have adoption patterns for cloud options and capabilities. We need to define functions and interfaces that reflect a standard adoption model. We shouldn't have to have a different way of doing this, the same things in different ways. In other words, and I've seen this, as I'm sure you have as well, we have different teams that consume the same service, but in different ways. And we go and apply a policy to that, and some align to it using the same service, others may not. So what we have to start to think of is to help define what we call guardrails, to help protect and guide the adoption of these services with with policies that reflect the patterns of that adoption. And they need to strategically align with the workload demand so that we have smart and effective ways of implementing those policies.
Thanks, Tom. So those are all, that's a lot to consider out of the gates. There's even more key dimensions that I want to kind of bring to the attention of our audience here. Bear with me as I get our slide advanced. Bear with me. Just thinking about the title of our presentation today, it's all about innovating, being safe, and creating agility. And when we think about innovation and agility, does that automatically lead to a conflict or a trade-off with what it is to do things safely? So my question is really, how do the leaders here create a balance that is appropriate for the business that balances all three between safe, agile, and innovative? Tom, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you. Again, I'm going to re-emphasize that I really come back to how and when policies were created. So this is going to be, a bold statement, but I think written policies are obsolete. And the reason I say that is because at the time they were written, technology changes were occurring at a pace that was supported by a budget. In other words, when I would submit for a budget, it would go to the finance committee and it would take several weeks sometimes and often months to get that approval back. And then you'd build a plan, usually 5-year plan, to implement that model and do it over a period of time that matched depreciation and other components of the build process. The policies were written at that time, at that pace, and over that period of time to adapt to and implement a safe way of using that technology. But the written policy just doesn't really fit today's model. With changes occurring in real time, written policies can't keep up. So it's not only impractical, but it's even counterproductive to the intent of the written policy. What it means is, like, if I pull up a policy today about authentication and encryption, it may reference OAuth 1.0 and TLS 1.0, that's what I should use. But we all know today that's not practical, and it's certainly not a good idea. So policies have to be as agile as the systems they are protecting. And what this means is that we need a total integration into the software development lifecycle and the CI/CD process. So it's not just shift left, but it's really what I like to call the dynamic policy adoption and integration. So look at this. Consider loose versus hard policies. Those that we look at as those that we do versus those that we hold the application owner accountable for. And what that means is we sometimes will say, hey, yes, it's a good idea to do that. But it doesn't always get implemented, as a, hey, this is a good idea. It's something you should do. The must word, or the policy that's what I call the hard policy, has to not only be implemented and followed, but adhere to it in real time in a real and effective way. Often we have to go back and review that implementation. We have to check to see if they actually did it or not. So we end up with these, what I call the hot spots, the places where policies were ideally followed, but in reality weren't. So how do we fix that? How do we change? How do we adapt to that? Well, the way to really do that is to really integrate those policies to start the transformation into code. In other words, they have to be written as code into the application, into the work stream, into the CI/CD pipeline, so that it's actually part of the process. It's like calling a service or a dependency. It's going to be part of the build process, but it has to be written and developed in a way that's consumable. And I think that's truly critical in today's agile development process.
So Tom, that sounds pretty advanced, to build as code everything you need for your policies. Are there other ways to ensure that policies are adhered to? Shamiri, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think, information technology as an industry seems to have settled on a few different patterns for accomplishing things. And you've likely heard about them all, and some in maybe some worse light than others, things like waterfall, agile, XP, Scrum, et cetera, right? For me, each of those types of ways of doing things are good, but they have bounded applicability, right? So they're only good for certain cases, for certain expected outcomes, for certain project types. So I think the first task ensuring that policies are being followed is to pick the right process that makes sense for the type of project or the type of outcomes you're expecting, right? After you've determined that, then it's about determining the right time within that process to do policy checks. So, and I think ultimately adhering to policies is ultimately a procedural control. So while technical mechanisms exist, as Tom was alluding to, such as policy as code, we need our processes to ultimately enforce this. Checklists are a good way. And in the context of your selected process, the answer becomes more about what is checked for and when, rather than having one standard approach that every project has to follow. In our recent DevSecOps and architecture paper, we discussed several different approaches to kind of solution delivery, such as free exploration and best practice execution, and so on. And in each of those approaches, where you enforce and how you enforce policy changes, and it also directly influences the success of the outcomes.
Interesting. So I'm still a little bit worried about the conflict between innovation and agility. Harish, how do you see balancing between those two?
I'd like to actually start by acknowledging what Tom indicated, right? Therein lies some part of the balance. And I think I'm going to extend on what he mentioned when he talked about almost enforcing policy through code, right? And I think there's a concept that is still evolving and something that we've started talking about internally also is called governance by design. Right. So when somebody in an organization hears governance, there's always defensiveness. Hey, that's going to slow me down. That is not what we're trying to do. In fact, with the right software, I mean, CI/CD is a very it's a classic example of how we control the quality of a process. If not for it, the continuous integration and delivery that it talks about is there's a guardrail in how we roll out, deploy code, software into for consumers. If not for the guardrail, then the quality is going to suffer. Then the customer experience is going to suffer, and even the brand or the organization is going to suffer because it could be a compliance issue, it could be a regulation issue, it could be losing data. We don't want to be doing that, right? So in this case, the policy application is through automated code deployment. That is not going to restrict agility. In fact, it's going to speed up agility, but in the beginning, the trade-off, if you were to even call it that, would be ensuring that there is a mechanism within the organization which builds these things into place, builds the framework, builds the guardrails into place. So once that is established and it's well thought through, it becomes automatic, it becomes fast. And that is where you see some of the best companies in the world, they're able to deploy software anytime, no matter what time of the day or night, and however fast or enormous the traffic is, right, without impacting customer experience. So that is one approach of using governance by design to not only adhere to the policies, but also ensuring we have a safe and friendly customer experience. And the other aspect is actually having a set of principles, right? Not just having a one size fits for all. When you have a one size fits for all, then that is where it leads to confusion. But making sure you have smaller teams wherein the decision making is more centralized in those smaller teams instead of actually having to go up the layers to get a decision, right? So that if the tenets and the principles are well defined within an organization, it allows for informed decision making based on data. And there is bound to be trade offs in terms of, say, speed versus quality or availability versus risk. Those kind of decisions have to be discussed within the team. And having the strong, I think, the culture in terms of decision making using a data driven approach will really help address some of these gaps that you may experience. And that is where the innovation, we want to encourage innovation, considering that we need that for any growth, right? So that is where I would add some of my comments, Mark.
Thanks, Harish. I think there's another dimension that we want to consider too, or at least address to the technology leaders that are here at the conference. With respect to where everybody's starting point is, not everybody has a greenfield starting point. There's a lot of incumbent technologies that may have been fits and starts with going after their cloud initiative, and it may not have gone well. Would anybody like to chime in on how does kind of starting over matter, or how do you re-engage after perhaps a tough start?
Sure. I think I can go first on this, Mark. I think in some cases you need to work backward. What is the value you're deriving out of this? What is the customer value that I'm bringing? What is the business value? For any key decision makers in any company, by adopting cloud or adopting any method, any big change within an organization is an important decision for key stakeholders. It could be customers, it could be shareholders, it could be even the employees within the company. We need to articulate that customer value and then communicate it. This is the value we're trying to derive, and this is a journey. It's not something that can be done overnight. So, and it's a transformational journey because it's going to impact pretty much the entire organization. Think of any department. It could be finance, it could be security, technology, business. All these departments are going to have to change for the new method of working. But by showing them the value, again through what I referred back through OKRs, a clear data-driven approach will help them realize that yes, this is going to take time, but we're seeing the change come over, right? And this is also about education, learning. We have to also encourage communication through learning because this requires learning at every levels of the organization. That is going to motivate people and also make them understand that they have a stake in this. So that is where you get a lot more cohesion and a lot more involvement, engagement across everyone. That is what we want in any healthy organization, right? Over to you, Tom.
Yes, that's a very good point. One that I think is very relevant when it comes to how these decisions are being made and how we think about them in the process of integrating and breaking down silos and trying to look at consumption models that actually work. But I want to come back to the security concepts, and there's an important component to this that I think I want to emphasize here, which is the cultural change is needed. Writing a policy, even coding a policy or implementing a security protocol isn't going to change much. The only way real change can occur is through the culture. And the culture change has to be driven by enablement. And you have to enable teams to adopt the cultural change in ways that are conducive to their roles. And here's a good example. We look at infrastructure teams and we tell them all the time, hey, we want you to innovate. We want you to evolve. We want you to grow. But keep your heads down while you're working and keeping the lights on and make sure that's your top priority. So there's sort of contradictory, roles there that we're asking them to do. So what we have to do is to help change that culture. And one of the ways that I think we can do that is by enabling them to become part of the process. How do we have infrastructure teams start to author advisory, start to build and own security landing zones and contributing to service catalogs rather than telling them how things are going to be done, enabling them to be part of that build process. So this cultural change can really effectively impact the way that policies and security is adopted by these teams to make sure that they're part of their daily operational procedures and practices. And I think that's really critical for a successful consumption model to work in today's agile platforms. I think Shamir has made a good point about the costs of this and how controls can be, implemented. Shamir, you mentioned that earlier, and I was just wondering if you could kind of go back and help me understand how that is impacting these changes and how they can impact innovation.
Yeah, let me set the stage a little bit too, just as we're kind of summarizing. We've got technology executives in the audience here, and to try to kind of wrap up and prioritize the message we want to deliver as leaders to our own CEOs, we need to influence into changing direction and investing in cloud adoption. What's your pitch? What's your pitch to the CEO? So Shamir, kind of with that in mind, could you pick up where Tom led you and make your pitch?
Yeah, for sure. I think that there's probably two key messages. If I could get the CEO's time to give both. Firstly, I think innovation requires kind of the right conditions for success. As I was kind of talking about before, most of the approaches that we use have bounded applicability, and so we need to understand when we want to use what approach based off of the outcomes that we're hoping to get. And then within those approaches, when are good times to kind of enforce policy. As Tom and Harish have been talking about, policy, as written is kind of a dead form, right? Rules like that are meant to be broken, and so what we probably need to do at an organizational level is start to switch from here are the rules you must follow, whether it's greenfield or brownfield development, to here are the rules that we think should be followed, and here are some rules as to when you can break those rules, because we cannot design at the policy stage everything, or we can't predict every possible inevitability of every single project outcome. And so what I think the C-level needs to focus on is the second kind of two parts of that, right? One is determining when rules can be broken, like who can approve something like that, for example, and determining what the heuristics are that should be used when those rules are broken, right? So for example, what are we willing to compromise on to get a feature out? Are we willing to compromise on the security of our customers' data? If that's something we're unwilling to compromise on, then when we define those heuristics for we got a timeline, we got to get this feature out, we know that these heuristics will hold, and compromising the security of customer data is not one of the things we as a company are willing to accept. And that allows for that kind of distributed decision making to occur. So these rules and heuristics can be formed into definition of done checklists, basically, and that can be employed at appropriate times during kind of cloud adoption projects, right? The second key message, I think, is about establishing strong cost controls. From day one, cost in the cloud helps inform several other processes within the organization. From SRE teams, for example, by giving them performance and uptime metrics, and then to other like security teams, for example, by giving them a good understanding of the overall landscape of what services are actually in use and how much they are being used. So it provides that pretty holistic view. So I think, even in the brownfield scenario, establishing those cost control teams, technical cost control teams, are really, really important to starting the cloud journey correctly.
And Harish, how would you make your pitch?
Going back to the customer value, right? If the C-suites, and there are several personas there, right? It's the CIO, CEO, CTO, depending on who is actually driving these changes within the company, they need to work with the customer in mind. What is the value they're deriving? How do we measure? How do we communicate? How do we educate and how do we engage? All these are tied together, wherein we want to move away from a siloed mentality, right? It's not just a technology initiative, which is just funded by business or finance, and then it's forgotten and there's no engagement from business. We don't want that. It should be a collective effort that way, with all levels of engagement, and also being able to communicate that this is not something that can be done overnight. There is a calculated risk that you will end up taking. How do we measure it? How do we plan, act, refine, reiterate, and come back and refine ourselves again and again, right? So that change has to come from within the organization. So it is a methodical approach, is what my 2 cents would be in terms of how we approach this cloud journey. And in fact, modernization is not just cloud journey. Cloud is just one aspect of the coin here, wherein this is about modernizing and transforming the entire processes within a company. That's the way I would look at it.
Yeah, Harish, you mentioned one specific thing is kind of the question that comes up is how do you measure? What's actually one of the things that all of us here at OACA actually work on is a way to measure, which is that cloud maturity model. So I wanted to kind of transition and thank everybody, thank my fellow panelists here, Shamir, Tom, and Harish, on reflecting on all of this, and remind everybody that our organization, the Open Alliance for Cloud Adoption, has some great material freely available. One of those is the cloud maturity model, which can help plot a course and measure where you are and where you're going with respect to investments you're making in cloud. And I wanted to thank eCore for inviting us to participate today. Thank you very much. We'll be available for questions later today.